So previously we focused a lot on training machine learning models. However, sometimes we are also interested in designing machine learning systems. So in this video I will give you a brief overview of some of the considerations that we have to make when we are designing machine learning systems. So concretely we will briefly talk about requirements, machine learning problem formulations, data collection, model development and evaluation, deployment, and monitoring and maintaining our models. So before we start designing our machine learning system, it's useful to think about the requirements of our system. So for example, we may have business requirements such as increasing the number of subscriptions or sales. Or for example, there are user requirements where we want to think about what features our machine learning system should contain. And then there are of course also performance requirements, computational and predictive performance requirements. So these are all things that are good to flesh out before we design our machine learning system. And then as a second step, it's a good idea to translate our requirements into a concrete machine learning problem. So a first question to ask here is actually, do we really even need machine learning here? And then if our answer is yes, what are our inputs? How do they look like? For example, they could be text, images, or tables. And similarly, we have to think about the outputs, what we want the model to return, for example, category labels or prices. And then, of course, another important consideration is what type of model we even use. So also something to think about before we start designing our system. And then after we translated our requirements into a machine learning problem, we also have to think about the data collection. So there are a few questions we may ask here. For example, where does our data come from? Or how is the data stored and how can we access the data? And is the data even clean and reliable? So as you can see, there are a lot of questions that we have to ask ourselves when we talk about the data set. Now suppose we have our model requirements and we have the data. The next step to worry about is the model development and evaluation. So for that, it's always good to start with a baseline. So we should ask ourselves, what is a good baseline and what type of model should we use here? For example, decision trees, convolutional networks, and so forth. And it also depends on what loss function we want to optimize. So a question to ask is how our loss function looks like, how we optimize it, and how it aligns to our business and other requirements. And then similarly also what performance metrics we should track to check whether our model satisfies our requirements. So suppose we successfully developed our model, the next step would then be to worry about the deployment. So a question to ask here is whether the model should be deployed as a cloud or a web application. Or maybe it should also be able to run offline, for example, on a cell phone. So for that, we then have to think about different hardware constraints and the user interface for our model. And then after our deployment stage, we also have to worry about monitoring and maintaining our model. For example, we want to ensure that our model stays accurate, even under data drift. And sometimes, we also want to make improvements, of course, like increasing the accuracy of our model or reducing the latency. So these are all important considerations when we are designing machine learning systems.